the sun-drenched island at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, has always been a place of enduring beauty and rich history. Its landscape, dotted with ancient ruins, fertile farmlands, and towering mountains, tells the story of civilizations past. Yet, for all its grandeur, Sicily's historical narrative also includes many quieter, lesser known chapters. One such chapter revolves around a seemingly unremarkable invention, the windmill. Windmills, now a common sight across the globe, have a surprisingly ancient origin in the Mediterranean. Their presence in Sicily, in particular, traces back to a time when the island's economy and culture were primarily agricultural. But why did ancient Sicilians, who had a wealth of agricultural ingenuity and many other ways to harness power, choose to adopt and adapt windmills so fervently? Was it simply because they were useful tools for grinding grain, or was there something deeper at play? To answer this question, we must first consider the peculiar geography and climate of Sicily. The island's dry summers and windy winters created an ideal setting for the harnessing of wind power, with vast stretches of open land, particularly in the central plains. Sicilians had access to the kind of steady, reliable wind necessary for windmills to function efficiently. While the ancient Greeks and Romans used watermills to harness the power of flowing streams and rivers, windmills offered a new possibility, a way to make use of the natural winds that swept across the island's coastlines. The earliest recorded evidence of windmills in Sicily dates back to the 9th century. During the Arab rule of the island, the Arabs, renowned for their advanced engineering and agricultural techniques, are credited with introducing windmills to Sicily. They used the windmills primarily for grinding grain, a crucial part of their agricultural economy. These early windmills, known as post mills, were simple but effective. They were constructed with large, flat sails mounted on a central post, which could be turned to face the wind. Once the wind direction was determined, the mill would harness the force of the wind to turn a millstone, grinding grain into flour. The adoption of windmills in Sicily was not just a technological advancement, it was also a response to the specific challenges faced by the island's agricultural economy. Sicily's farming was highly dependent on grain production, but the island's hilly terrain and lack of consistent freshwater sources made traditional watermills impractical in many areas. The windmill, therefore, offered a solution to this problem, providing a reliable means of grinding grain without the need for constant access to running water. But the windmill was more than just a solution to a practical problem. It also symbolized the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Sicilian people. The winds that swept across the island were often unpredictable, shifting directions and changing in intensity. To harness the power of these winds, Sicilian engineers had to develop intricate systems of gears, pulleys, and shafts to control the motion of the windmill. The process of creating and maintaining a windmill required an intimate understanding of both mechanics and the environment, blending human skill with the unpredictable forces of nature. By the 12th century, when the Normans ruled Sicily, windmills had become an integral part of the island's landscape. They were not only used for grinding grain, but also for other agricultural tasks, such as pumping water for irrigation. In fact, the windmill became so essential to daily life in Sicily that it became a symbol of the island's agricultural prosperity. At the time, Sicily was one of the most productive regions of Europe, and its windmills played a crucial role in maintaining this status. The windmills became synonymous with Sicilian life itself, quiet, enduring, and ever present. But what exactly made windmills so beloved by the ancient Sicilians? Was it purely their utility, or was there a deeper, more profound connection between the Sicilian people and their windmills? In Sicily, the windmill was more than just a tool, it was a fixture of everyday life, often associated with the rhythms of nature and the passage of time. The sound of the windmills turning sails became as much a part of the Sicilian landscape as the call of the seabirds or the rustling of olive trees. For the farmers who relied on these mills, windmills represented a connection to the land, a quiet, constant reminder of the cyclical nature of life. They worked with the wind, not against it, using its power to sustain their livelihoods. As the years went by, the windmill became woven into the fabric of Sicilian culture. It was a symbol of hard work, of the harmony between humanity and nature. It represented the quiet persistence of the island's people, who learned to adapt to their environment and thrive despite its challenges. For the Sicilian farmers, the windmill was more than just a tool for grinding grain. It was a symbol of resilience. Yet, as with any piece of technology, the windmill's influence was not without its challenges. Over time, the rapid expansion of the island's population and the increased demand for agricultural production led to pressure on the land and its resources. Windmills, once a symbol of sustainable agriculture, began to face challenges of their own. As more and more were built, the question arose, could the windmill continue to serve its purpose in the face of changing agricultural practices and the pressures of modernization? By the 14th and 15th centuries, the once thriving network of windmills in Sicily began to experience significant transformations. The technological advancements of the time, alongside shifts in agricultural practices, started to alter the island's landscape and the role of windmills in daily life. While the windmill had been an essential part of Sicily's agricultural identity, it was now facing challenges that would slowly diminish its prominence. The introduction of more advanced milling techniques, such as the watermill, along with changes in crop rotation and land management, reduced the reliance on windmills for agricultural tasks. Watermills, which were capable of operating in areas with ample freshwater sources, offered more consistent and controlled milling, especially during the dry seasons when wind could be erratic. With more efficient and versatile technology, farmers began to turn to watermills, especially in Sicily's fertile river valleys and coastal areas where water was abundant. However, the windmill had not yet been entirely eclipsed. While watermills were becoming more common, windmills still held an important place, particularly in areas where water was scarce or difficult to access. In the inland areas of Sicily, where rivers were few and far between, the windmill remained the most practical solution for grinding grain. Windmills continued to dot the landscape, particularly in the more remote and arid regions of the island. In addition to their agricultural uses, windmills began to play a role in Sicily's growing economy. By the late Middle Ages, Sicily was becoming a hub of trade and commerce in the Mediterranean, and its cities, such as Palermo and Catania, were expanding rapidly. The demand for grain and other agricultural products grew, and with it, the need for milling. Windmills, once purely rural tools, now served an urban function, providing vital services to a growing population. It was at this point that the windmill truly became a symbol of Sicily's resilience and adaptability. Even as new technologies emerged, the island's windmills persisted, reminders of an earlier age, quietly grinding away in the background of daily life. But as Sicily entered the early modern period in the 16th and 17th centuries, the island underwent profound social and economic changes. The windmill, once a symbol of Sicilian ingenuity, began to face new challenges that would eventually lead to its decline. A shift in agricultural priorities, the decline of feudalism, and changes in the island's labor structure all contributed to the gradual obsolescence of windmills. Furthermore, the increasing dominance of large-scale commercial agriculture meant that the small, locally operated windmills could no longer compete with more modern mills powered by water or steam. One of the key factors that contributed to the windmill's decline was the changing nature of Sicily's agricultural economy. During the Middle Ages, small farms and family-run businesses had been the backbone of the island's agricultural production. These small operations often relied on windmills for grinding grain and processing other agricultural products. However, as Sicily's economy became more integrated into the broader European market, large estates began to dominate the agricultural landscape. These vast plantations, often owned by wealthy landowners or foreign nobility, operated on a much larger scale and could afford the investment in more modern milling technology. Windmills, which had once been a symbol of local independence and self-sufficiency, were now seen as inefficient compared to the large, mechanized mills that were increasingly dominating the agricultural industry. The decline of feudalism in Sicily also had a direct impact on the windmill's place in society. Under the feudal system, landowners had been responsible for maintaining and operating windmills, often using them as a means of controlling the local peasantry. Windmills were not just functional tools, they were symbols of power and control. The peasantry was required to pay a fee, known as a milling toll, every time they brought grain to the mill. This system ensured that the landowners retained significant control over the local economy. However, as Sicily moved toward a more modern, capitalist economy, the role of landowners and the feudal system diminished. Without the same concentration of power in the hands of the few, the traditional windmill system began to falter. As windmills began to disappear from the island's landscape, their place in the cultural consciousness of the Sicilian people remained. The once ubiquitous presence of windmills in rural areas faded, but their memory lived on. The windmill continued to be celebrated in songs, stories, and local traditions, becoming a symbol of the island's agricultural past. In some ways, the decline of windmills marked the end of an era, the end of a time when Sicily's agricultural economy was intimately tied to the rhythms of nature and the unpredictable forces of the wind. But despite this decline, windmills never truly disappeared from the island's collective memory. Even as more advanced technology took hold, the image of the windmill remained a part of the island's identity. By the 19th century, when steam-powered mills began to dominate, the windmill had become something of a nostalgic relic. In the minds of many Sicilians, it was a symbol of an era when life had been slower, simpler, and more connected to the land. Yet, one question remains. In an age of modern technology and industrialized agriculture, What is it about these ancient windmills that continue to capture the imagination of the Sicilian people? The windmill, once the heart of Sicilian agriculture, may have faded from the island's landscapes by the early 20th century, but it never disappeared entirely. Today, the ruins of ancient windmills still stand in remote corners of Sicily, reminders of a time when the forces of nature were tamed by human ingenuity. Though the windmill itself had largely been replaced by more modern technology, its legacy continues to shape the island in ways that may not be immediately apparent. In the modern era, Sicily's reliance on wind power has experienced a curious revival. With the rise of renewable energy in the 21st century, Sicily has once again looked to its natural resources to meet the demands of the future. The island, now a part of the European Union's push for sustainable energy, has become a hub for wind farms, with massive wind turbines dotting its hills and coastlines. This new form of wind power is far removed from the simple, hand constructed windmills of the past, yet it stands as a testament to the enduring relationship between the island's people and the wind. The shift from traditional windmills to modern wind turbines has been driven by the global need for cleaner, more sustainable energy. As the world grapples with the effects of climate change, Sicily, with its strong winds and ample space, has become a key player in the production of renewable energy. The island's natural environment, once harnessed by small windmills to grind grain, is now being used to generate electricity, contributing to Europe's green energy goals. Interestingly, the revival of windmills in a different form has prompted a reconsideration of the island's agricultural past. As Sicily grapples with the effects of modern agriculture, soil erosion, overuse of water resources, and the loss of traditional farming methods, many are beginning to look back at the simpler, more sustainable practices that characterize the island's earlier history. There is a growing interest in preserving the remnants of the old windmills, not just as historical relics, but as symbols of a time when the island's economy and culture were closely tied to the land. The idea of returning to a simpler, more sustainable way of life has gained traction in recent years, as farmers and environmentalists alike see value in revisiting some of the old practices. Windmills, once a sign of technological innovation, have now become a symbol of resilience and self-sufficiency. The lessons of the past, embodied in the quiet turning of a windmill's blades, are once again being embraced in the context of modern environmentalism. Yet, there is an undeniable tension between the past and the future. As modern wind turbines rise across Sicily's landscape, many Sicilians wonder whether the island's deep connection to the wind can truly be revived in the same way. The large, industrial wind turbines are a far cry from the quaint, hand-built windmills that once dotted the countryside. The scale and technological complexity of today's turbines are a stark contrast to the simple, almost poetic, nature of the ancient windmill. For some, the windmill's charm lies in its connection to the rhythms of nature, its slow, steady turning in harmony with the wind. The windmill was a part of daily life, an ever-present companion to the farmer, the miller, and the family. Modern wind turbines, in contrast, are impersonal and industrial, often located far from the communities that once relied on windmills for their livelihoods. For these modern turbines, the wind is just another resource to be harnessed, rather than a force with which to coexist. The legacy of the ancient Sicilian windmill, however, is not confined solely to its practical uses. It has also come to symbolize something deeper: the resilience of the island's people and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Sicily has faced countless challenges throughout its history: foreign invasions, economic crises, and environmental hardships. But the windmill stands as a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of the Sicilian people. It was a tool that helped sustain them during difficult times, and it continues to serve as a symbol of their ability to overcome adversity. In recent years, local preservation efforts have sought to protect the remaining windmills on the island, especially in the rural areas where they are still found. These efforts aim to preserve the historical and cultural significance of the windmill as an integral part of Sicilian heritage. The windmills, often in various states of disrepair, are carefully restored by local craftsmen and conservationists who view them not just as historical monuments, but as living symbols of Sicilian identity. In this way, the windmill continues to inspire a sense of pride and connection to the past. As modernity continues to sweep across Sicily, with its cities growing and the pressures of globalization mounting, there are still many who believe that the windmill holds valuable lessons for the future. The windmill, with its simplicity and ingenuity, offers a quiet, enduring example of how humans can work in harmony with the natural world to meet their needs. Its legacy is a reminder that even in the face of rapid technological advancement, there is wisdom to be found in the past, if only we are willing to look back and learn. But perhaps the most poignant question remains: in a world increasingly dominated by technology and industrial progress, what can the windmill teach us about the balance between nature and human innovation? Is there a way to revive the spirit of the windmill in the modern world, or has it become nothing more than a relic of a bygone age? The answer may lie somewhere between the past and the future, in the quiet turning of blades in the wind, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring innovations are those that come not from the machines we build, but from our ability to understand and work with the forces of nature. And so, as the windmills continue to stand, both as relics of a bygone era and symbols of modern sustainability, one must wonder how much of our future will be shaped by the lessons of the past, and how much will we continue to overlook in our quest for progress. The life of a medieval Sicilian farmer was a life defined by hard work, perseverance, and a constant battle against the forces of nature. Unlike the bustling cities of Palermo or Catania, the rural farmsteads of Sicily were quiet, isolated places where the rhythms of daily life revolved around the seasons, the land, and the simple but vital tasks of survival. Imagine for a moment stepping into the worn boots of a farmer in 13th century Sicily. The day begins early, before the sun has fully risen. The air is cool, the sky just beginning to lighten with the faintest trace of dawn. The farmer, whose name might be Giovanni, opens the door of his small stone cottage, which sits perched on a hillside overlooking the rolling fields of wheat, olives, and vines. The small home, made of local limestone, has thick walls designed to trap the coolness of the night and protect from the scorching midday sun. Inside, the sparse furnishings, wooden chairs, a table, and a simple hearth speak of necessity rather than comfort. The morning chores are immediate and pressing. Giovanni's first task is to check on his livestock goats, chickens, and perhaps a mule or two. These animals provide much needed resources for his family: milk, eggs, wool, and the occasional meat. He heads to the small stone barn where the animals sleep, its dark interior smelling of hay and earth. Here, the animals stir, bleating and clucking as they sense the beginning of another day. Once the animals are tended to, Giovanni heads to the fields. The fields of Sicily are vast, but they are divided into smaller plots, each one used for different crops, depending on the season. Wheat, barley, and oats are grown in the colder months, while olives and grapes take root in the warmer, summer months. Giovanni's farm, though small by modern standards, is a blend of crop cultivation and animal husbandry, two pillars of rural life in medieval Sicily. The fields are often separated by low stone walls, built to keep out the wandering animals and mark the boundaries of one farmer's land from another. The Sicilian landscape, dotted with olive groves and vineyards, is picturesque, but it is also harsh. The island's Mediterranean climate means that summers are long and hot, while winters can be wet and cold. The soil, though fertile, can be difficult to work, requiring careful tending and years of experience. Giovanni's work is heavily dependent on the seasons. In the winter, the focus is on preparing the land for planting, plowing fields, repairing stone walls, and pruning grapevines. Spring and summer, however, are when the real work begins. It is during these seasons that Giovanni must plant, tend, and harvest the crops that will sustain his family through the year. He may spend long days in the fields, his back bent under the weight of his work, his hands calloused from the steady work of sowing seeds, weeding, and harvesting. The grain is threshed by hand, and olives are picked from the gnarled branches of trees that have stood for centuries. Life on the farm is not without its dangers. The Sicilian countryside is wild, and even in the 13th century, it is not free from the threat of marauding bands of thieves, pirates, or even local bandits who prey on the small, isolated farms. The threat of invasion is always present. Sicily's position in the Mediterranean made it a frequent target for foreign invaders. The Arabs, Normans, and later the Spanish each left their mark on the island. For Giovanni, this history of conquest is not just distant memory, it's an everyday concern. On rare occasions, he might hear the distant rumble of horses' hooves or see a plume of smoke rising in the distance, signaling that danger is near. The farmers of medieval Sicily, like Giovanni, were not only dependent on their skill and hard work, but also on the weather and the wider global events that often reached their isolated farms in unexpected ways. A poor harvest, a sudden storm, or a shift in trade routes could mean disaster. Giovanni, like most farmers, also knows the importance of community. In times of harvest or crisis, neighboring families would come together to help with tasks, often a collective effort that allowed the small villages to survive and thrive. Giovanni's day is also marked by the local rhythms of the church. The small stone chapel, perched atop a nearby hill, holds a significant place in the community. The toll of the church bell marks the passage of time, calling people to prayer at regular intervals throughout the day. Giovanni, like many others, is deeply religious. His life on the farm is seen through the lens of faith, and his struggles, triumphs, and daily work are all seen as part of a greater divine plan. Meals are simple bread, cheese, perhaps a small portion of vegetables or meat, but Giovanni is grateful for what he has. The concept of abundance is not one that he is familiar with. Life is about sustenance, not excess. Yet, even amidst the hardships and struggles of his daily life, there is a deep sense of connection to the land and to the cycles of nature that govern his existence. Giovanni understands that everything is interconnected: his family, his livestock, his crops, and the weather. Everything must be in balance for the farm to survive. The windmills that dot the landscape, quietly turning in the breeze, are not just functional, they are part of this balance, helping to grind grain and pump water to irrigate the fields. But as Giovanni continues his work, there is a constant question in the back of his mind. His farm, though sustainable, is also vulnerable. What would happen if the rains fail, or if an invader comes? Could the traditions of the past, his father's knowledge of the land, and his forefathers' reliance on simple tools continue to sustain him in an ever-changing world? As Giovanni watches the sun rise higher over the hills, he finds himself wondering how much longer this way of life will endure. In a world of shifting political alliances and rapidly changing technologies, how long can the small farmer, like himself, hold on to the traditions that have sustained generations? As the years passed, Giovanni's world slowly began to shift in ways that even he, with all his years of experience and connection to the land, could not have predicted. While the rhythms of the seasons remained the same, the political and economic forces shaping Sicily were not static. The winds of change, carried on the tides of empire and trade, were beginning to stir the quiet farmsteads of Sicily. By the 14th century, the island was firmly under the rule of the Crown of Aragon, and it was during this period that Sicily began to experience the deepening effects of centralization and royal control. In theory, this meant greater stability and security. But for Giovanni and his fellow farmers, it often meant more burdens to bear. The taxes on the land began to rise as the crown sought to extract more resources from the island's fertile soil to support the expansion of its empire. The feudal system, though not fully abolished, continued to exert its influence on the rural population, with landowners demanding more from their tenants in terms of rent, labor, and taxes. Giovanni found himself struggling to maintain the balance he had always relied upon. The demands of the crown and the landowners were overwhelming. The small, independent farm that had once been his livelihood was now caught in a system of dependency and obligation. The windmills that had once been symbols of freedom and self-sufficiency were now, for many, a reminder of a more oppressive reality. While the windmills still served their purpose in the grinding of grain, they also began to serve as tools of control. Tolls had to be paid to use them, and the prices were set by the local lords. Giovanni, like many others, could no longer afford to operate the mill himself. Meanwhile, the land, once abundant and fertile, was starting to show signs of strain. Over-farming, combined with the increasing presence of foreign invaders, disrupted the delicate balance that had kept the farm running smoothly for generations. The crops, though still growing, did not produce as abundantly as they once had. Giovanni's wheat fields, which had once yielded enough grain to feed his family and the surrounding village, were now producing far less. The olive groves, which had been the pride of his farm, began to suffer from disease, as the warmer climate of the island attracted pests that had not been seen before. It was not just the crops that were suffering. Giovanni's connection to his land was beginning to fray. The demands of external forces, be they economic or political, were making it harder to maintain the farming practices that had been passed down through generations. His father's methods, which had once been seen as time tested and reliable, were no longer as effective in the face of changing circumstances. The family's once pristine stone walls, which had kept the animals in and the intruders out, were beginning to crumble. Giovanni's own hands, once strong and steady, were now showing signs of the wear and tear of years of labor. The growing threat of external conflict also loomed over Giovanni's life. Sicily's position in the Mediterranean made it a prime target for invasion, and during this time, the island found itself caught in the ongoing power struggles between the Aragonese, the French, and the other Mediterranean powers. Giovanni's farm, isolated on its hillside, was not immune to the effects of these broader conflicts. There were rumors of pirates raiding the coast, and the occasional band of mercenaries passing through the countryside, looting and burning everything in their path. The village that once felt safe and familiar was now a potential target. Giovanni and his neighbors had to live with the constant fear of the unpredictable, whether it was a poor harvest or an unexpected raid. Life on the farm had become a game of survival. Yet, despite the challenges he faced, Giovanni remained committed to his farm and his way of life. In his heart, he knew that there was little choice but to adapt. The question of whether he could continue to sustain the land in the face of growing pressures was one that loomed large. How much longer could he rely on the windmill, that once proud symbol of Sicilian resilience, to carry the weight of his family's survival? And what would happen to his way of life if the external forces, be they economic, political, or military, continued to encroach on his land? The simple truth was that Giovanni's farm and the way of life that it represented could not remain the same forever. The medieval world of Sicily was changing rapidly, and the forces of modernity were beginning to have an undeniable impact on even the most traditional of farms. It was no longer enough to simply work the land in the way that his father had. Giovanni had to adapt or risk being left behind. One of the greatest challenges Giovanni faced was the increasing pressure to participate in a more complex economy. Trade was becoming more important, and the feudal lords who controlled the land were more interested in profit than ever before. The practice of bartering, which had once been the backbone of rural trade, was now being replaced by a cash-based system. Giovanni had little experience with money. He had always traded his goods for what he needed, whether it was grain or cloth or tools. But now, the system was changing. He was forced to rely on the market to sell his grain, olives, and other products. The prices were set by the larger powers, and there was little room for negotiation. The market, though offering the promise of profit, was also a source of instability for someone like Giovanni, who had grown accustomed to the predictability of his simple, rural life. Perhaps the most difficult realization for Giovanni was the gradual loss of independence that came with these changes. The windmill, which had once been a symbol of freedom, of a life lived in balance with nature, was now part of a larger, more complex system. The mill itself, which had once been a tool for self-sufficiency, had become a commodity. Giovanni had to pay to use it, just as he had to pay rent to the landowner for the use of his fields. The windmill was no longer something that he controlled. It was something that controlled him. As Giovanni worked in the fields one late summer afternoon, his thoughts began to turn to the future. What would happen if the current system continued to tighten its grip? Would there be any space left for the small farmers like himself to continue? Could he and his family survive in an economy that seemed increasingly out of their control? In the distance, he heard the familiar sound of the windmill's blades turning slowly in the breeze. It was a comforting sound, but it also felt like a reminder of a past that was slipping away. Giovanni knew that, like the windmill, his life on the farm was changing. The question remained, would he be able to hold on to the old ways, or would he be swept away by the forces of change? By the dawn of the 16th century, Giovanni's world had changed in ways that he could not have fully anticipated. The old ways of his farm, rooted in generations of tradition, were being slowly but inexorably displaced by the forces of progress and external pressures that he could not control. The rise of large estates, the expansion of centralized markets, and the continued spread of foreign influence all contributed to a shifting landscape that threatened his way of life. And, much like the windmills that once stood as symbols of self-sufficiency, the very tools Giovanni had relied on were now becoming relics of a past era. Giovanni's farm, once the embodiment of simplicity and independence, was no longer sustainable in the face of the changing world around it. While the seasons still followed their natural course, the economic and political forces that shaped Sicily were moving swiftly in directions that seemed out of his control. The new systems of agriculture, with larger, mechanized mills and centralized markets, left little room for small farmers like Giovanni, who had lived a life based on local trade and small-scale production. The traditional windmill, which had once been a cornerstone of his farm's operation, was now a symbol of a bygone era. The tolls on the windmills, levied by the local lords, had made it increasingly difficult for Giovanni to afford their use. Even though he still relied on it to grind his grain, the cost of using the mill was rising, and it no longer seemed like a tool of self-reliance. It had become an expensive necessity that added to his burden. The centralization of the economy was another factor that contributed to Giovanni's growing disillusionment. Once, he had traded his surplus grain and olive oil with his neighbors or exchanged them in local markets, but now he found himself increasingly at the mercy of larger, more distant merchants who controlled prices and dictated terms. The small, local trade networks that had once been the lifeblood of Sicilian rural life were slowly being replaced by a more globalized system of commerce. The island, once a place where the rhythms of life were set by the seasons and the land, was now becoming a cog in a much larger economic machine. And yet, Giovanni continued to work his land. Driven by a quiet sense of determination, he had no other choice but to adapt. As the winds of change blew stronger, Giovanni sought ways to make his farm fit into this new world. One of the first steps in this transition was to adapt his methods of farming. The once cherished small-scale techniques that had served his family for generations, those handed down by his father and grandfather, were no longer enough. The crops needed more efficient irrigation, and he had to learn new techniques to increase yield. Giovanni experimented with crop rotation and soil management techniques he had never considered before. He adapted to the changes in climate experimenting with more drought resistant strains of wheat and introducing new agricultural tools that he had seen used on larger estates. While these changes were necessary for his survival, they were also deeply unsettling. Giovanni, like many other farmers of his time, had grown up in a world that was rooted in tradition, in rituals that had been passed down from generation to generation. The introduction of new techniques and methods was not simply a matter of practical survival. It felt like a loss of connection to the land. The slow, steady rhythms of farming had been replaced by the frantic pace of the modern agricultural system. The care and attention to each individual plant were no longer as feasible when dealing with larger plots of land and more demanding market pressures. In this new world, Giovanni often found himself wondering what had been lost in the process. Could the simple joys of farming, of working the land with one's hands, survive in such a mechanized and impersonal environment? Despite the challenges, there was also a glimmer of hope. Giovanni's farm was not alone in its struggles, and in fact, many of his neighbors were going through similar transitions. As the island of Sicily gradually adapted to its new economic landscape, there was a growing sense of solidarity among the small farmers. Local farmers began to organize into cooperatives, pooling their resources in an attempt to compete with the larger estates and commercial interests. By working together, they were able to share equipment, reduce costs, and ensure that their goods remained competitive in the changing market. Giovanni became involved in these efforts, finding that, despite the hardships, there was strength in numbers. As small farmers came together to pool their resources, they also started to rebuild the old networks of local trade and barter that had been disrupted by the expansion of global markets. The cooperative system was not without its challenges. The larger estates and commercial landowners still held significant influence over the market, and the power dynamics between the wealthy landowners and the peasants remained as stark as ever. But for the first time in a long while, Giovanni began to feel a sense of control over his future. The windmills, though no longer the central hub of his farm, had come to symbolize the resilience of Sicily's rural farmers in the face of external pressures. In a way, the small windmills that had once been symbols of independence had now become emblems of collective action, reminders of how the simple, everyday tools of the past could help guide them through an increasingly complex future. The cooperative model, though not a perfect solution, marked a significant shift in the way that Sicilian farmers viewed their relationship with the land and each other. It was an acknowledgement that survival in a world of increasingly centralized power required new forms of solidarity and collective action. The land might have been shifting beneath their feet, but there was still strength to be found in the bonds of community. As Giovanni worked alongside his neighbors, the windmill continued to turn slowly in the distance, its blades still catching the wind. The noise it made, once a constant reminder of his family's independence, now seemed to echo the larger changes taking place across Sicily. The future, though uncertain, held the promise of a new kind of agriculture, one that balanced the old ways with the demands of modernity. And though Giovanni could never fully return to the past, he found solace in the idea that he and his neighbors could carve out a new way forward, guided by the lessons of their forefathers. But as he stood in the fields, watching the windmill spin gently in the breeze, one question lingered. In the face of global forces and industrialization, how long could small-scale agriculture truly survive? Would the island's rich agricultural traditions ultimately be swept away? Or would they adapt and endure in a new, more cooperative form? The story of the Sicilian farmer's resilience is not just a story of adaptation, it is a story of enduring connections, of working with the land, and of finding strength in community. In the quiet turning of the windmill, there is still much to be learned, but as Sicily moves forward, it is clear that the spirit of the old ways will continue to shape the future, even if it must be reimagined. This chapter of Sicily's agricultural history may have ended, but its echoes will continue to shape the island for generations to come. The ancient city of Syracuse, located on the southeastern coast of Sicily, stood as one of the great centers of the Greek world. With its towering walls, magnificent temples, and thriving marketplace, Syracuse had long been a beacon of wealth and culture, but it was also a city built on military power. Aided by the strategic location of its harbors and its naval strength, Syracuse had become a formidable force in the Mediterranean, with its influence extending across the islands and into mainland Greece. However, it was this very might that would soon draw the eyes of its enemies, most notably the mighty Roman Republic. In 214 BC, during the Second Punic War, Syracuse found itself at the center of a dramatic clash between the expanding Roman power and its long-standing Greek traditions. The city's involvement in the conflict began with a series of diplomatic miscalculations, alliances, and betrayals that culminated in one of the most intense and historically significant sieges in antiquity. The Romans, eager to gain control of Sicily and weaken the Carthaginian forces that had allied with the Syracusans, turned their attention to the ancient city. At the time, Syracuse was under the rule of King Hieronymus, a young and ambitious monarch who, despite his inexperience, had ascended to the throne after the assassination of his grandfather, King Hero II. His reign was precarious from the outset. Hieronymus sought to balance the city's political interests between Rome and Carthage, but his choices ultimately plunged the city into conflict. When he allied with Carthage, the Romans wasted no time in retaliating. They launched a military campaign against Syracuse, laying siege to the city in 214 BC. The Romans, led by the renowned general Marcus Claudius Marcellus, knew that capturing Syracuse would be a significant blow to Carthage and a vital step in securing their dominance in the Mediterranean. Marcellus, a seasoned strategist, quickly understood that a direct assault on the fortified city would be far too costly. Instead, he devised a methodical approach to wearing down Syracuse's defenses. The Roman siege forces began by cutting off Syracuse's vital supply lines. The city's wealth had long been drawn from its trade networks and its ability to control the sea. By blocking Syracuse's access to food and reinforcements from the sea, Marcellus sought to weaken the city's resolve and starve it into submission. For a time, this tactic seemed to be working. The Syracusans, caught off guard by the Romans' efficiency, began to feel the strain of the blockade. But the defenders of Syracuse were not ready to surrender. Inside the city, the Syracusans rallied around their most famous citizen Archimedes, the legendary mathematician and inventor Archimedes, though primarily known for his work in geometry and physics, had long been a close advisor to the city's leaders. As a man of science, he had a deep understanding of mechanics, and his brilliant mind would prove to be one of Syracuse's greatest assets during the siege. Archimedes was not just an academic, he was also a brilliant engineer. He had already contributed to the development of war machines, but with the threat of the Roman siege looming large, he threw himself into devising even more advanced inventions to protect the city. The Romans may have been more numerous and well equipped, but Archimedes believed that his ingenuity could tip the balance in Syracuse's favor. He set about designing complex machines to defend the city, including enormous catapults that could launch stones at the Roman ships and the famous Archimedean claw, a device capable of lifting and sinking enemy vessels. The city's walls, reinforced by these new machines, became a testament to the Syracusans' resistance. The Romans, despite their military prowess, were now faced with an enemy that fought back with not only strength, but also innovation. The battle would not be won through brute force alone. Syracuse's ingenuity was enough to hold the Romans at bay for several months. But, despite the city's defenses, the Romans slowly gained ground. They brought siege towers and battering rams to breach the walls, and their navy worked relentlessly to block Syracuse's harbors. Marcellus, though frustrated by the stalemate, recognized that the only way to break the siege was to force a final, decisive confrontation. The Romans knew that the key to breaking the Syracusan resolve lay in controlling the vital supply lines, and the Romans were determined to starve the city into submission. As the siege dragged on, the Syracusans grew increasingly desperate. The city's stores of food dwindled, and the once proud defenses began to show signs of wear. Archimedes' machines were still functional, but even they could not hold back the waves of Roman soldiers. The defenses of Syracuse were beginning to buckle under the strain of prolonged siege warfare. Inside the city, Hieronymus, the young king, began to feel the pressure of his precarious position. The Syracusans, despite their loyalty to their city and their inventions, were beginning to question whether the war was worth continuing. Should they try to negotiate with the Romans? Could they trust the Roman offer of peace? Would the city's traditional values of independence be preserved, or would they be lost to the expanding Roman Empire? Hieronymus, under increasing pressure, began to vacillate, unsure of whether to continue fighting or to seek peace with Rome. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that the inevitable finally occurred. The Romans, having spent months preparing for the final assault, were ready to make their move. The question now was whether the defenders of Syracuse, with their brilliant inventions and determined resistance, could hold out just a little longer, and what would happen when the Romans eventually broke through. Would the city's famous innovations and strategic defenses be enough to turn the tide of the siege, or would the military might of Rome ultimately prove to be overwhelming? As the tension in the city grew, the people of Syracuse, caught between their fear of invasion and their hope for survival, could only wait for the outcome. The time for diplomacy seemed to have passed, and the battle was now one of attrition. The very soul of Syracuse hung in the balance, as both sides prepared for the final act of this long and bloody siege. The tension inside Syracuse had reached a boiling point. For months, the city had resisted the Roman siege with a mix of fierce determination, brilliant inventions, and sheer will. But as the days wore on, the resources within the city continued to dwindle, and the pressure from the Romans intensified. Even the brilliant Archimedes, whose inventions had so far helped to stave off the Romans, could not prevent the inevitable forever. The day of reckoning was fast approaching. As the Romans launched their final assault, Archimedes remained at his workshop in the heart of the city. Though the defenses were being slowly breached, he refused to leave the machines he had so carefully designed. His mind, always working, was consumed with thoughts of ways to defend his city to the last possible moment. Yet, as the walls of Syracuse began to crumble and the Roman army closed in, Archimedes faced an unbearable truth. The city was out of time. The Roman general, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, had spent months attempting to break the city's defenses. His patience and determination had finally paid off. The Romans had found a way to breach the walls using siege towers and battering rams. The once great walls of Syracuse, reinforced by Archimedes' engineering marvels, had started to falter under the relentless pressure. The windmills symbols of the city's ingenuity had been left behind, and now the reality of the city's situation was undeniable. No number of war machines, no matter how ingenious, could hold back the Roman tide forever. It was at this moment of greatest peril that the legendary inventor Archimedes truly came into focus. His last acts of resistance were a testament to his unyielding commitment to the defense of Syracuse. One of the most famous stories from this period involves his design of the Archimedean claw, a machine that was capable of lifting Roman ships out of the water and capsizing them. This mechanical marvel was just one example of the many war machines Archimedes had created in a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the siege. However, as the Romans pushed closer to the city center, the situation grew more dire. The Romans, having learned of Archimedes' brilliance, had made capturing him a top priority. There are varying accounts of how Archimedes met his fate, but one of the most persistent and evocative stories involves his death at the hands of a Roman soldier in the heat of the city's fall. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Archimedes was deep in thought, possibly sketching out his latest invention, when a Roman soldier, undistracted by the legend before him, ordered him to come with him. Archimedes, lost in his work and unaware of the collapse of the city around him, reportedly said, "Do not disturb my circles." These words, perhaps as much a reflection of Archimedes' intense focus on his studies as a moment of defiance against the overwhelming forces of Rome, would be his last. The soldier, angered by Archimedes' apparent disregard for his orders, struck him down. This tragic end has since become emblematic of the conflict between the intellectual and the military, the pursuit of knowledge and the realities of war. The death of Archimedes is often seen as a symbol of the tragic loss of genius at the hands of political and military forces. Yet, his legacy was far from over. The machines he invented and the work he did during the siege of Syracuse would live on in the annals of history, influencing future generations of engineers and mathematicians. Meanwhile, the Romans, led by Marcellus, eventually breached the final walls of Syracuse, but the victory came at a steep price. The Roman forces, having lost so many men during the siege, were exhausted, and the once proud city of Syracuse, reduced to rubble, finally fell into Roman hands. The fall of Syracuse marked a turning point in the Second Punic War and solidified Roman control over Sicily, but it also marked the end of an era for the ancient Greek world. The story of the siege of Syracuse is not just one of military conquest. it is also a story of human ingenuity, resilience, and the costs of war. It was a contest between the might of Rome and the brilliance of a single man, a battle between brute force and intellectual achievement. Archimedes' machines, though ultimately unable to stop the Roman advance, were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of invention. As Syracuse was finally subdued, Marcellus ordered the city to be looted, and its residents either killed or enslaved. However, the Romans recognized the value of the city's cultural and intellectual heritage. The city's scholars, including those who had worked alongside the Archimedes, were spared, and many of the city's treasures were preserved. Marcellus, in his own way, seemed to acknowledge the intellectual legacy of Syracuse, though he would never know the full extent of Archimedes' influence on the future of science and engineering. Yet, as Syracuse lay in ruins and the Romans set about their conquest, one must ask, how much did the fall of the city and the death of Archimedes really change the course of history? Was the victory truly the end of the road for the intellectual achievements of the Greeks? Or would the legacy of men like Archimedes live on in ways that no one, not even the Romans, could have foreseen? The fall of Syracuse to the Romans in 212 BC marked the end of a glorious chapter in ancient history. The city, once a beacon of Greek culture and military might, was now under Roman control. The strategic importance of Syracuse had been immense, as it was not only a vital hub in the Mediterranean, but also the center of intellectual and scientific achievement, thanks to figures like Archimedes. Yet, despite the destruction wrought by the Romans, the city's influence would not be extinguished. The legacy of Syracuse and of Archimedes would endure in ways that no immediate conquest could have foreseen. The Roman conquest of Syracuse was, in many ways, a bittersweet victory. Marcellus and his forces had successfully broken through the city's defenses, capturing the great walls, towers, and gates. The death of Archimedes at the hands of a Roman soldier became a symbol of the clash between the intellectual pursuits of the Greeks and the military might of Rome. Though the Romans had destroyed the physical city, they could not erase the contributions of the great minds who had once called Syracuse home, and so, even in defeat, the spirit of Syracuse lived on, not through the rubble and wreckage of its buildings, but through its legacy of learning. The aftermath of the siege saw Syracuse stripped of its wealth, its people either killed or enslaved, and its treasures looted. However, despite the devastation, the Romans understood that they had conquered more than just land. They had conquered a culture, and that culture was rich with intellectual achievements that they could not simply discard. In a rare moment of acknowledgement, Marcellus ordered that the works of Archimedes and other prominent scholars of the city be preserved. Though the city had fallen, the Romans recognized that Archimedes' genius was something that transcended the boundaries of political conquest. The scientist's works on geometry, mechanics, and inventions would influence not just the Romans, but the course of Western thought for centuries to come. Archimedes' legacy, though lost to the immediate aftermath of his death, would live on, preserved through his writings and the stories passed down by those who had worked alongside him. The machines he invented, from the catapults to the Archimedean claw, would inspire countless generations of engineers. His understanding of the physical world, as reflected in his mathematical discoveries, would lay the foundation for future innovations in science and technology. The famous Archimedes principle in fluid mechanics, which describes how objects displace water, would not be rediscovered until centuries later, but it would forever remain a testament to his brilliance. The story of Archimedes' death, though tragic, also symbolized something larger: the clash between intellectualism and military power, and the fragility of knowledge in the face of war. Yet, while Archimedes perished, his intellectual contributions would continue to guide humanity for millennia, influencing not only the Romans, but also the Islamic scholars of the Middle Ages, who would later preserve and expand upon Greek and Roman scientific knowledge. In the centuries following the fall of Syracuse, the city itself would never regain its former prominence. The Romans turned the city into a province of their vast empire, and though Syracuse remained an important administrative center, it was no longer the cultural and intellectual capital it once had been. The Romans would eventually build their own structures and institutions, and Syracuse would become one of many Roman cities, its intellectual vibrancy diluted by the larger, imperialized culture that now controlled the Mediterranean world. However, as the Roman Empire expanded and eventually split, the influence of Greek learning would continue to be felt, particularly in the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, which would carry on the traditions of Greek thought long after the fall of the West. The preservation of Greek knowledge, much of it through the works of men like Archimedes, would form the backbone of Renaissance thought. Later, during the Islamic Golden Age, many of Archimedes' works were translated into Arabic, preserving them for future generations. Perhaps one of the most enduring symbols of Archimedes' legacy is the way his intellectual pursuits influenced the course of scientific and engineering thought throughout history. His discoveries laid the foundation for the later development of physics, mechanics, and engineering. The principles he uncovered about levers, pulleys, and buoyancy were applied in everything from Renaissance inventions to modern-day machinery. The very idea of using mathematical formulas to explain and predict the physical world has shaped modern science, and Archimedes is considered one of its earliest pioneers. For the people of Syracuse, the fall of their city might have been a tragedy, but it was also a transition. They had lived through the intellectual flowering of Greek thought, and though their city was no longer the vibrant center of learning it once was, the seeds of their legacy had been scattered far and wide. As the Roman Empire continued to expand, the memory of Syracuse's intellectual giants lived on in the minds of scholars, engineers, and philosophers. The Greeks, though defeated on the battlefield, had won a different kind of victory, a victory of the mind, whose influence would span centuries. And so, the question arises, what is the true cost of empire? Is it the physical destruction of cities, the loss of life, or is it the eventual forgetting of the ideas and knowledge that once shaped those cities? In the case of Syracuse, the Romans may have defeated the city militarily, but they could never fully extinguish the intellectual fire that had once burned so brightly there. In the end, it was the ideas of men like Archimedes that proved to be the lasting legacy not just of Syracuse, but of all of humanity. The legacy of Syracuse, like the great windmills of the island, continued to turn silently in the background of history, shaping the world in ways that no single siege, no matter how brutal, could ever truly erase. The city had fallen, but its influence, the lessons of resilience, intellectual curiosity and innovation would endure. And so, as we look back at the fall of Syracuse and the death of Archimedes, we must ask ourselves how many other great intellectual legacies have been lost to the ravages of war, and how many more will continue to influence future generations, even from the ruins of the past. The Roman Empire, at its height, was a marvel of engineering, culture, and social organization. From its vast roads and aqueducts to its towering amphitheaters and monumental temples, the Romans were known for their ingenuity and ambition. Yet, for all their monumental achievements, there was one cultural institution that stood out as an everyday luxury, an institution that was as integral to Roman life as the very walls of the city itself. The Roman bathhouse. The origins of Roman bathing culture can be traced back to the early days of the Republic, but it wasn't until the 1st century BCE and the rise of Imperial Rome that baths became an essential part of Roman daily life. The idea of bathing itself was not unique to the Romans' many ancient civilizations. From the Greeks to the Egyptians, had a long history of bathing rituals. However, the Romans took these traditions to new heights, both literally and figuratively. They transformed bathing into a public, communal activity, not just a hygienic necessity, but also a vital social experience. For the Romans, bathing became an art form, a sophisticated combination of luxury, socializing, and relaxation. The first Roman bathhouses were simple affairs. Early baths consisted of little more than a hot bath and a small steam room. However, the Roman genius for engineering soon took over, and the baths expanded into grand complexes that could accommodate thousands of people. These massive bathhouses were often located near busy commercial areas, close to Roman forums, markets, and theaters, ensuring that they were easily accessible to the public. At the heart of every Roman bathhouse was a system of sophisticated plumbing and heating. The Romans, renowned for their mastery of engineering, developed the hypocaust system, a revolutionary method for heating the baths. The hypocaust was a network of underground furnaces and channels that pumped hot air under the floors and through the walls of the bathhouses, creating a warm, steamy environment. This heating system allowed Romans to enjoy warm baths even during the coldest months of the year. In fact, bathing became so integral to Roman culture that the wealthy, as well as the common citizens, would regularly visit the baths to unwind and socialize. The typical Roman bathhouse, or thermae, was divided into several key areas. The first was the frigidarium, the cold room, which was often used to cool down the body after the heat of the other rooms. Next was the tepidarium, the warm room, where bathers would acclimatize before moving on to the caldarium, the hot room, where the most intense heat was found. These rooms were equipped with pools of varying temperatures, allowing bathers to move from one to the other in a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to cleanse and refresh both body and mind. The baths were more than just places for bathing. They were centers of Roman social life. For the wealthy, the baths were an opportunity to show off their status, but for the common people, the baths were a vital space for socializing, networking, and engaging in daily activities. The bathhouses became places for political discussions, intellectual debates, and even business transactions. In addition to the baths themselves, many thermae featured libraries, exercise rooms, and gardens, making them not just places for hygiene, but also centers for cultural and intellectual exchange. For the Romans, the bathhouse was a place where class distinctions could be temporarily erased. While the wealthy would enjoy the finest bathhouses with extravagant decorations, marble floors, and intricate mosaics, the common people could still enjoy a similarly relaxing experience in the more modest public baths. These public baths were often subsidized by the state or wealthy individuals who saw the baths as a way to earn political favor. The belief was that by providing access to such luxuries, even the lowest of Roman citizens would feel gratitude toward the emperor or politician, ensuring their loyalty. Though bathing was a communal experience, it was not without its rituals. Romans would often visit the baths in the late afternoon or evening, spending hours moving between the different rooms. Bathing was often followed by massages, which were available to those who could afford them, as well as vigorous scrubbing and scraping, often performed by attendants using a tool called a strigil. Bathers would use olive oil as a skin cleanser, and after scraping the oil off with the strigil, they would finish with a refreshing plunge into the cold pools of the frigidarium. The bathhouses were also home to a variety of other activities. Many Romans would engage in exercise in the palaestra, an open-air courtyard where individuals could practice wrestling, ball games, or other forms of physical fitness. It was here that many men would prepare their bodies before heading to the baths. Others might wander through the gardens, enjoying the beauty of the lush greenery and fountains. The bathhouses were not just places of hygiene, but centers of leisure and entertainment spaces where people could spend the day socializing and engaging in a variety of activities that kept them connected to the rhythms of Roman public life. The grandest of Roman bathhouses were not confined to Rome itself. As the empire expanded, the Romans built lavish bathhouses in their provinces. The Baths of Caracalla, one of the largest and most magnificent bath complexes in the empire, stand as a testament to the grandeur of Roman bath cultures. Located in the heart of Rome, these baths could accommodate up to 600 bathers at once and boasted luxurious facilities, including gardens, libraries, and even a large gymnasium. The Baths of Diocletian, another monumental complex, were similarly grand and would later be repurposed as a church and museum during the Renaissance. However, the importance of the Roman bathhouse extended far beyond its practical use or its status as a symbol of Roman luxury. The public bathhouses of Rome, which were free or low cost for the general populace, represented a form of public welfare and accessibility. They reflected the Roman commitment to providing for the common people in a society where social hierarchies were rigid and class divisions were deeply ingrained. The public baths offered a rare space where people from all walks of life could gather, engage, and enjoy the benefits of Roman engineering and civic pride. But even as the baths flourished, one must ask, how long could this tradition endure? The decline of the Roman Empire brought with it economic and political instability, and the maintenance of such lavish public spaces became more difficult. With the rise of Christianity, with its ascetic values, eventually lead to the abandonment of these indulgent communal spaces. Could the baths, with all their grandeur, survive the turbulence of Rome's later years? As the empire began to crumble, so too did the magnificence of the Roman baths. Yet, the legacy of the baths, Their innovations and their role in the social fabric of Roman life would live on in the cultural memory of Europe. The question remains, though, what would the fall of Rome mean for a society that had placed such an emphasis on physical well-being, leisure, and community? As the Roman Empire began to fragment during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the once grand bathhouses, symbols of imperial Rome's prosperity, slowly fell into disrepair. What had once been grand communal spaces, teeming with bathers, philosophers, soldiers, and politicians, began to empty, and the luxuries of Roman life gradually faded. The decline of the bathhouses is intimately tied to the broader decline of the empire itself, as political instability, economic hardship, and changing cultural norms all contributed to their eventual demise. The initial cracks in Roman bath culture appeared during the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a time of political chaos, economic collapse, and military upheaval. The Roman Empire was beset by invasions, internal rebellions, and a series of weak emperors who were unable to maintain control over the empire's vast territories. The result was an economy in turmoil. Resources were stretched thin, and the wealth that had once funded the construction of lavish bathhouses began to dwindle. With the empire unable to maintain the infrastructure necessary for these grand public works, many of the most famous bathhouses, such as the Baths of Caracalla and the Baths of Diocletian, began to fall into neglect. The lack of resources meant that maintenance was impossible, and the grand heating systems, aqueducts, and water supply systems that had made the baths so extraordinary started to fail. The opulence that once defined these spaces was replaced by decay. This period also saw the transformation of Roman society. As the empire shifted from paganism to Christianity, attitudes toward indulgence and luxury began to change. The Christian Church, which had become a powerful force in Roman politics by the 4th century, did not share the same appreciation for public bathing. The Church's ascetic values, which promoted self-denial and modesty, stood in stark contrast to the opulence and communal enjoyment of the Roman baths. Church leaders began to view the bathhouses as decadent and immoral, associating them with the hedonistic pleasures of the Roman elite. By the early 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of invasions from barbarian tribes, many of the grand baths were abandoned or repurposed. Some were stripped for materials, their marble floors and columns looted to build other structures. The hypocausts that once heated the bathhouses fell into disrepair, and the once bustling frigidariums, caldariums, and tepidariums were left cold and silent. In some cases, the bathhouses were repurposed for other uses. The Baths of Caracalla, for example, were converted into barracks for soldiers, and the Baths of Diocletian were eventually transformed into a Christian church and monastery. These transformations were indicative of the larger shift in Roman society, from a culture that celebrated public leisure and physical health to one that valued religious devotion and asceticism. What was once a social hub for all Romans, rich and poor alike, was now either lost to the ravages of time or repurposed to serve the needs of a Christianized empire. However, the decline of the bathhouses did not signify the complete disappearance of Roman bathing culture. Though the grand, imperial bathhouses fell into ruin, bathing itself remained a significant part of life. for many Europeans throughout the Middle Ages. The process of cleansing oneself remained integral to daily life. Even if the context and style had shifted, in the medieval period, smaller bathhouses, usually connected to monasteries or local communities, continued to operate, although they lacked the grandeur and engineering feats of their Roman predecessors. In the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived after the fall of the West, public bathing continued to be a part of daily life, albeit on a much smaller scale. The Byzantine baths were more modest than their Roman counterparts, but still drew on Roman traditions. And some of the architectural designs of Roman bathhouses were adapted in Byzantine bathhouses. The legacy of the Roman baths lived on in these smaller, less elaborate versions, particularly in cities like Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where the communal nature of bathing remained a social activity. Despite the persistence of bathing culture in the Eastern Roman Empire and the medieval period, the grandeur of the Roman baths was forever lost. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the once advanced plumbing and heating systems were abandoned, and many of the great bathhouses were left to the ravages of time. The concept of the grand public bathhouse, with its elaborate plumbing, vast spaces, and communal atmosphere, would not be seen again until the Renaissance, when the rediscovery of classical knowledge spurred a renewed interest in the ancient world. Interestingly, it was not just in the East that remnants of the Roman bathhouse could be found. As the European Renaissance began to take shape in the 14th and 15th centuries, intellectuals and architects looked back to the classical world for inspiration. Ancient Roman texts, including those that describe the grandeur of the Roman bathhouses, were rediscovered and studied. This rediscovery of classical ideas, along with the subsequent development of new architectural techniques, led to the construction of new bathhouses in some parts of Europe during the Renaissance. The Renaissance baths, though not on the scale of the Roman thermae, were a return to the idea of public bathing and leisure. In the cities of Italy and beyond, new bathhouses were built in the spirit of Roman design, incorporating some of the old Roman features, such as hypocaust systems and domed ceilings. These Renaissance bathhouses, however, were more about recreation and luxury than about the social and hygienic functions they had served in ancient Rome. As Europe entered the modern era, bathing culture underwent yet another transformation. The idea of public baths became less about grand social spaces and more about hygiene and health. In the 19th century, as industrialization and urbanization led to overcrowded cities, the need for sanitation and public health became more pressing. Public bathhouses, once the pride of Roman society, became a necessity in an era of growing urban populations and worsening sanitation. These baths were not grand monuments to luxury, but rather utilitarian spaces designed to promote cleanliness and prevent disease. Thus, the Roman baths, once symbols of imperial Rome's wealth, decadence, and engineering genius, evolved from their peak in antiquity to become simple hygienic institutions in the modern world. The transformation of Roman bathing culture reflects broader shifts in European history, from the heights of Roman luxury to the practical needs of public health in the modern era. Yet, even as the baths fell into decline, their influence on European bathing culture persisted. The idea of public bathing, the socializing that took place in these spaces, and the engineering feats that made the baths possible all lived on in varying forms throughout history. The Roman bathhouse may have crumbled, but its essence, its communal spirit and dedication to hygiene, found new life in different forms as Europe moved forward. In the end, one must ask, what did the Roman bathhouses truly represent? Were they simply places of luxury and indulgence, or were they emblematic of something deeper, of Roman society's commitment to the public good, to health, and to the idea of communal life? And how does the decline of these grand institutions reflect the broader changes in Roman society and in the world at large as the Western Roman Empire crumbled and its once glorious bathhouses decayed into ruins? The tradition of Roman bathing seemed to fade into the annals of history. However, like so many aspects of Roman culture, the influence of the bathhouse endured far beyond the fall of the empire, leaving its mark on future generations and continuing to shape the way Europeans viewed hygiene, social life, and leisure. Though the grand Roman baths no longer graced the cities of the West, the cultural and architectural legacy of these bathhouses did not vanish completely. Even as the empire dissolved and Europe entered the Middle Ages, the fundamental concept of communal bathing remained ingrained in the European mindset. The tradition of visiting public baths, while significantly altered, persisted for centuries, particularly in places that had once been part of the Roman Empire. By the time of the Byzantine Empire in the East, the remnants of Roman bathing culture were still alive. The Byzantines, inheriting many aspects of Roman life, continued to build bathhouses, though often in more modest forms compared to their Roman predecessors. In Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the famous Byzantine bathhouses, known as hammams, emerged. These structures, though smaller and less elaborate than the Roman thermae, still adhered to the same principles: large communal spaces with a system of heating, pools of various temperatures, and an emphasis on social interaction. The hammams were not just places to bathe, but also social hubs where people gathered to relax, converse, and conduct business, much like the Roman baths before them. In the West, the decline of the Roman baths left a gap in public life. The collapse of Roman infrastructure, combined with the rise of Christianity, caused a shift in attitudes toward bathing. Church leaders, who had once supported the therapeutic benefits of public baths, began to associate them with sin and decadence. The early Christian church, with its ascetic and puritanical values, viewed public bathing, often a space of indulgence, as morally questionable. As a result, bathing culture fell out of favor in much of medieval Europe, and public baths became less common, particularly in the more Christianized regions. But this decline was not permanent. As Europe transitioned from the medieval period into the Renaissance, there was a cultural revival, an intellectual and artistic reawakening that sought to rediscover and celebrate the ideas and practices of the ancient world. This Renaissance rediscovery included a renewed interest in the classical ideals of the Greeks and Romans, and bathing was no exception. The architectural designs and the concept of public bathing were once again embraced, especially by the wealthier classes. The Renaissance baths, while not as grand as their Roman predecessors, incorporated classical elements such as domed ceilings, heated floors, and ornate decoration. The Renaissance baths, though smaller and more intimate than the Roman thermae, reflected the same spirit of indulgence and leisure that had characterized Roman bathing culture. The wealthy elite, in particular, began to build private baths in their homes, drawing inspiration from the Roman past. These new baths, often adorned with elaborate frescoes and mosaics, were not just places to cleanse the body, but also spaces where individuals could entertain guests, hold intellectual discussions, and engage in social networking. The Renaissance bathhouses, like their Roman ancestors, were symbolic of a larger culture of luxury, leisure, and intellectual life. Yet, the true resurgence of public baths in Europe came during the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of industrialization and the rapid growth of urban populations. Cities began to see the need for public hygiene facilities in the wake of increasingly crowded and unsanitary living conditions. The state recognized the importance of public health, and public bathhouses were once again built in major European cities. Unlike the indulgent bathhouses of the Romans and Renaissance, these new public baths were largely focused on cleanliness and sanitation. They were often stark, utilitarian spaces designed to provide the general public with basic bathing facilities. Still, the social function of the bathhouse persisted. Though no longer centers of intellectual exchange or political discourse, public baths continued to play a significant role in social life. For the working class in rapidly industrializing cities, the bathhouse remained one of the few places where they could relax, socialize, and cleanse themselves after a hard day's work. Bathhouses in cities like London, Paris, and Vienna became vital parts of urban life, reflecting a more pragmatic approach to public health while still retaining echoes of the social and communal aspects of their Roman forebears. The 19th century also saw the rise of thermal spas, bathing centers focused on health and relaxation, often located in rural or mountainous areas. These spas, which drew inspiration from the ancient Roman practice of thermal bathing, were promoted as places where people could recover from illness, relieve stress, and rejuvenate their bodies. The use of mineral waters, believed to have healing properties, became a key feature of these spas, which, much like the Roman baths, combined physical therapy with leisure and relaxation. Today, the legacy of Roman bathing culture lives on in many modern practices. The rise of wellness culture and the continued popularity of spas, saunas, and thermal baths all trace their roots to the Roman bathhouse. In fact, many of the principles that defined Roman bathing, the use of hot and cold water, the focus on relaxation, and the integration of social spaces continue to inform modern spa designs. The enduring popularity of places like the Turkish hammams, the French thermal baths, and the Nordic saunas attests to the continuing relevance of the Roman bathing tradition. Moreover, the resurgence of interest in Roman and Renaissance architecture, as well as the broader fascination with ancient Rome, has led to the preservation and restoration of many ancient Roman bathhouses. The baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, and the famous Pompeii baths have become important historical sites, offering modern visitors a glimpse into the grandeur of Roman public life. These ancient ruins are not just reminders of a lost civilization, they are symbols of the enduring legacy of Roman ingenuity, leisure, and community. As we reflect on the long history of Roman baths, we are reminded of how a simple practice of bathing evolved from a utilitarian necessity into a symbol of social engagement, health, and luxury. The Roman baths were not just about cleanliness, they were about connection, both to oneself and to others. Even as the Roman Empire crumbled and its bathhouses fell into disrepair, the essential nature of the bathhouse, the idea that communal spaces could serve both physical and social needs, remained alive in various forms across the centuries. So, what does the legacy of the Roman bathhouses tell us about the human need for relaxation, community, and care? How much of the culture of leisure and wellness that we take for granted today is built on the ancient Roman foundations of the bathhouse? And in an increasingly individualistic world, what can we learn from the communal aspect of bathing that once brought people together? The Roman Empire, at its height, spanned an extraordinary expanse from the windswept highlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. Its borders stretched across vast lands, across mountains and rivers, and through the heart of Europe. Such a vast empire required an infrastructure that could unite its territories, support trade, facilitate the movement of troops, and ensure the steady flow of communication between the farthest reaches of the empire and the heart of Rome itself. And it was through one of the most remarkable feats of engineering that the Romans managed to achieve this: the construction of their vast network of roads. Roman roads, known for their durability and efficiency, were a cornerstone of Roman expansion and control. From their earliest days as a republic to their later incarnation as an empire, the Romans had always understood the importance of connectivity. A road was not just a path to travel on, it was a tool of power, a means to bring the far-flung regions of the empire into the fold, and a symbol of Roman discipline and control. The ancient roads of Rome laid the foundations for much of modern transportation, influencing the development of infrastructure long after the fall of the empire. The Roman approach to road building was methodical, practical, and ingenious. Roman engineers developed techniques for road construction that would endure for centuries. At its most basic, the Roman road was a layered structure designed for durability and efficiency. A Roman road would typically consist of several layers. The first layer, the statumen, was made of large stones placed directly on the ground to provide a solid foundation. Above this, a layer of gravel rutiratio was placed to ensure stability. Next, smaller stones and a mixture of sand and lime nucleus formed a smooth, solid surface, which was then compacted to form a smooth, durable road. Finally, a top layer of tightly fitted paving stones, summa crusta, created the familiar hard surface, which was essential for long-distance travel and heavy loads. One of the remarkable aspects of Roman roads was their consistency. Roman engineers applied the same techniques and principles to road construction across the empire, ensuring that roads built in Britain were just as well made as those in North Africa. This standardization of road construction allowed for the quick movement of troops, trade goods, and people across diverse terrains, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the Alps. The roads were designed not only for efficiency, but for longevity, and they often endured for centuries after their creation. But the Romans didn't just build roads for practical purposes. They also used them as a tool for maintaining their power. Roads were the veins through which the empire's military might flow. The Roman legions, always ready to defend the empire's vast borders, were able to march quickly to any part of the empire where they were needed. Thanks to the extensive road network, it was said that the Roman soldier could travel up to 25 miles a day, largely due to the superior roadways they marched upon. This mobility gave the Romans a tremendous strategic advantage over their enemies, allowing them to reinforce one region or send reinforcements quickly to quell rebellions elsewhere. In addition to their military uses, Roman roads also facilitated the spread of Roman culture and ideas. As the roads expanded, so too did the influence of Roman law, art, architecture, and language. Roman roads were the arteries through which the empire's culture flowed, bringing the sophisticated Roman way of life to the farthest corners of the empire. Cities and towns sprang up along these roads, serving as hubs of Roman influence. Through these urban centers, Roman culture was disseminated to the rural areas, creating a cohesive cultural identity that spanned the empire. One of the great triumphs of Roman engineering was their ability to build roads through challenging terrains. Roman engineers had a remarkable ability to adapt their techniques to local conditions. In the rugged mountains, they built high-altitude roads that included tunnels and bridges to bypass difficult terrain. In the low-lying marshlands, they raised roads on embankments to prevent flooding. The construction of roads through the Alps, which were once thought to be impassable, is considered one of the great feats of Roman engineering. The Via Augusta, a road that connected northern Italy with Spain, included extensive bridges, tunnels, and elevated sections that enabled the Romans to cross some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The Romans didn't just focus on creating straight roads, they also constructed sophisticated drainage systems. Roman roads were built with a slight curve to allow water to flow off the surface, ensuring that roads wouldn't become waterlogged and unusable. Ditches and culverts were built along the sides of roads to help carry rainwater away from the surface. In this way, the Romans ensured that their roads remained passable in all weather conditions, making them reliable even in the wettest months of the year. But despite the vastness and sophistication of the Roman road system, it wasn't just the roads themselves that made them so significant. The creation of the roads was an expression of Roman identity, culture, and discipline. Roads were not simply utilitarian, they were symbols of Roman power, a physical manifestation of the empire's dominance. The roads connected the farthest reaches of the empire to the heart of Rome, where emperors and senators could direct the course of history. The very act of building roads represented the Romans' unyielding belief in their ability to impose order and unity on the known world. The most famous of all Roman roads was the Via Appia, or the Appian Way, which ran from Rome to the southeastern coast of Italy. Construction of the Via Appia began in 312 BCE and was one of the first roads designed specifically for military use. Over time, the Appian Way became a major artery of trade, culture, and movement. It was often called the Queen of the Roads, and its legacy is still felt today. Sections of the Appian Way are still in use, and modern roads in Italy often trace the same routes that were laid out by the Romans centuries ago. But as the Roman Empire began to decline, so too did the empire's infrastructure. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD led to the disintegration of many of the road networks that had once bound the empire together. Without the resources and political stability to maintain these roads, many of the Roman roads fell into disrepair. Over time, much of the infrastructure was lost, and the roads became less and less functional. Yet, even as the empire crumbled, the legacy of Roman roads lived on. Their construction techniques were studied and admired during the Renaissance, and many of the roads built by the Romans would form the foundation of Europe's modern transportation network. In fact, it was the road building expertise of the Romans that provided the basis for later European road systems. Many modern highways and motorways in Europe still follow the paths laid down by the Romans thousands of years ago. In many ways, Roman roads were the lifeblood of the empire, an essential part of the structure that held the empire together. The roads allowed Rome to expand its military influence, to trade across its vast borders, and to spread its culture throughout the known world. But as we reflect on the enduring legacy of these roads, we must ask, how much of Rome's greatness was truly built upon its infrastructure? Would the empire have reached the same heights of power without its advanced road system? Or were these roads the key to its success? As we look at the roads that still connect us today, we are reminded that the legacy of Rome's engineering marvels is not just about the past. It is about how we continue to connect with each other and how, through the lessons of the past, we build the foundations of the future. As the centuries wore on and the Western Roman Empire collapsed, much of the Roman road system fell into neglect. With the decline of the empire came a loss of resources, political instability, and a weakening of centralized authority. Without a governing body that could maintain infrastructure, the once great network of Roman roads began to deteriorate. Roads that had once connected distant provinces, supported armies, and enabled trade across the empire were now abandoned or repurposed by new societies with differing priorities. The fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD and the rise of feudalism in Europe contributed to a shift in the way roads were viewed and maintained. The stability and the central authority of the Roman Empire that had supported the infrastructure of roads vanished. Many of the Roman roads, which had been designed to serve military and trade needs, became irrelevant as local kingdoms and tribal societies took over the former Roman territories. In the early medieval period, the repair and maintenance of Roman roads were no longer a priority. Roads that had once been paved with well-laid stone were now left to the elements, and the sophisticated drainage systems that had been so carefully engineered fell into disrepair. The centralization that Roman roads had once supported gave way to a patchwork of smaller, less connected regions. Local rulers, more focused on maintaining their immediate domains, did not have the means or the desire to preserve the grand infrastructure built by the Romans. This decline continued throughout the Middle Ages, and much of the original Roman road network was lost to the ages. Forests grew over forgotten paths, and villages and towns arose along new routes that were less dependent on the ancient highways. Roman roads, which once served as symbols of Roman dominance and engineering mastery, became relics of a bygone age, only remembered by a few local historians and engineers. However, as with many lost aspects of Roman culture, the decline of Roman roads was not the end of their story. The rediscovery and revival of Roman roads began in earnest during the Renaissance, a period in which Europe looked to its classical past to inspire a new age of intellectual and artistic achievement. During the Renaissance, as scholars rediscovered the writings of ancient authors and engineers, the influence of Roman engineering began to be felt once more. Ancient texts describing Roman infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and aqueducts, were carefully studied and admired. The writings of Vitruvius, for example, whose work De Architectura described Roman engineering principles, played a significant role in rekindling an appreciation for the technical knowledge of the ancient world. The period's fascination with Roman antiquity led to the rediscovery of several major Roman roads and highways. Scholars, architects, and engineers began to study the remains of the ancient roads, seeking to understand their construction and layout. It was during this time that many Renaissance roads and highways were constructed along the same paths that had been laid by the Romans centuries before. The example of the Romans served as a guide for engineers who sought to replicate their achievements, often directly tracing new roads along Roman routes. Renaissance Italy, in particular, saw the resurgence of road construction as cities and towns sought to improve their connectivity. The rediscovery of Roman engineering principles led to the development of more sophisticated roads, particularly in the regions once controlled by the Roman Empire. Cities such as Rome, Florence, and Venice started to integrate older Roman roads into their growing networks, repairing and expanding the original routes to better serve the needs of their flourishing economies. This period of rediscovery had a profound impact on the development of road systems in Europe, as Renaissance engineers adapted Roman road building techniques to meet the demands of the time. They established a new standard for road construction that would later spread throughout Europe. During the Enlightenment and into the 18th century, the road networks in Britain, France, and in other European nations began to resemble Roman systems more closely. Paved roads, bridges, and tunnels, once the hallmark of the Romans, began to be built anew, influenced by the ancient designs that had been revived. The role of roads as essential conduits for commerce, travel, and communication was also revisited during this period. As European economies grew and nations began to establish colonies and trade networks, the need for efficient and well-maintained roads became more pressing. Governments and wealthy landowners recognized that improving road infrastructure was essential for stimulating trade, moving goods, and connecting their expanding empires. In this way, the study of Roman roads and the lessons learned from their construction directly contributed to the development of modern transportation networks in Europe. One of the most striking examples of the rediscovery of Roman roads during this period was the revival of the Via Appia, the famous road that ran from Rome to the southeastern coast of Italy. The Via Appia, once a symbol of Roman military power and efficiency, had fallen into disrepair after the fall of the empire. During the Renaissance and beyond, efforts were made to restore portions of the Via Appia and to create new roads along its route. Today, much of the Via Appia still exists, and its legacy as one of the first and most important roads of the Roman world remains. However, the rediscovery of Roman roads was not just about practical engineering. It was also about reconnecting with the cultural and intellectual heritage of ancient Rome. The revival of Roman infrastructure was symbolic of the broader Renaissance movement, which sought to return to the ideals and achievements of classical antiquity. Just as the Renaissance artists and philosophers looked to the Greeks and Romans for inspiration, so too did engineers and architects look to the practical achievements of the Romans when rebuilding their cities and empires. As the centuries passed, the legacy of the Roman road system continued to influence the design of modern transportation networks. Even today, many of Europe's modern highways and motorways follow the same routes that were once laid out by Roman engineers. The principles of road construction developed by the Romans, such as careful planning, the use of durable materials, and the importance of maintaining road stability through drainage and grading, continue to be applied in modern engineering projects. So, as we reflect on the history of Roman roads, one must ask, what is the true significance of these ancient highways? Were they simply practical tools for the empire's expansion, or do they represent something deeper, an enduring connection between past and present, a symbol of human ingenuity, and a testament to the timeless need for connection and communication? The rediscovery and continued use of Roman roads show us that some structures, whether physical or cultural, are too important to be lost. Even in the face of the collapse of empires and the shifting tides of history, the legacy of the Roman roads endures, connecting us not only to the past, but to each other. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire's power dwindled, the once glorious road network it left behind became the foundation for the road systems of modern Europe. Despite centuries of neglect and disrepair following the fall of Rome, the legacy of Roman roads proved too resilient to fade into obscurity. The very routes that had once connected the great cities of the Roman Empire, Rome, Alexandria, Carthage, and Londinium, would eventually form the core of Europe's modern road infrastructure. In many ways, the roads that the Romans built are still with us today, quietly shaping the world we navigate. As Europe entered the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution spurred a renewed interest in efficient transportation systems. As the world grew smaller, with trade networks and populations expanding at an unprecedented rate, the need for fast and reliable roads became more pressing than ever. And so, the influence of Roman roads re-emerged just as it had done in the Renaissance, this time to shape the age of industry. The practical advantages of Roman road construction: durability, efficiency, and strategic planning were evident to engineers of the modern era. European nations, eager to build transportation networks capable of supporting growing cities and economies, turned to the Roman model. Early modern roads were built with Roman principles in mind, with careful attention paid to grading, drainage, and ensuring roads were built to last. The great Roman techniques, such as creating roads that sloped slightly for drainage and using durable paving materials, were mirrored in the construction of roads and highways that crisscrossed Europe. This revival of Roman road building principles was most evident in Britain, France, and Italy, where the legacies of Roman infrastructure were carefully studied and adapted. One of the most famous modern examples of Roman road influence can be found in the United Kingdom in the early 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution accelerated the growth of urban centers and the need for efficient trade routes. Engineers such as John Loudon Macadam took inspiration from the Roman road system. Macadam's macadamized roads, made from layers of crushed stone and gravel, were designed to mimic the durability and resilience of the Roman method of road construction. Though macadam's innovation wasn't a direct replica of Roman roads, it was inspired by the principles that the Romans had first pioneered, particularly the focus on providing solid, stable surfaces for long distance travel. Similarly, in France, the Napoleonic era saw the construction of a network of roads designed to increase military mobility, echoing the Roman system that had facilitated Roman legion movements centuries before. The construction of wide, straight roads designed for rapid movement of troops and goods was central to Napoleon's strategy, much like the Roman roads had been to the expansion and maintenance of the Roman Empire. The planning and design of these roads often followed the routes laid out by the Romans, a tribute to their long-lasting ingenuity. In Italy, where the legacy of Roman roads is most directly connected to the modern landscape, the roads built by the Romans have continued to shape the country's infrastructure. In many parts of Italy, modern highways still follow the routes that were first paved by the Romans. For instance, the Via Appia, one of the most famous Roman roads, still exists in parts today and is a key thoroughfare for traffic traveling through the Italian countryside. It is remarkable to think that a road built nearly 2,300 years ago is still serving the needs of modern transportation. Roman roads also left their mark in the realms of communication and trade. By the 19th century, with the rise of railways, the infrastructure of Roman roads once again became the backbone of European travel and commerce. Rail tracks often followed the paths of Roman roads, taking advantage of their already established routes through natural terrain. Even the early rail networks recognized the strategic importance of the road systems the Romans had built, as they provided the most direct, accessible paths across the landscape. In this sense, Roman roads did not just inform the design of future roads, they laid the foundation for an entire transportation revolution. However, the legacy of Roman roads in the modern world is not only about the practicalities of infrastructure, it is also about the enduring ideas they represent. The Roman road system was more than just a network of paved paths connecting cities. It was a manifestation of the Roman vision for the world. The Romans believed in uniting their empire through infrastructure, in making distant lands feel connected to the heart of the empire. They saw roads as a means of spreading Roman influence, of bringing law, order, and culture to all corners of their empire. In many ways, the Roman road system symbolized the Roman ideal of civilization itself, a belief in the power of engineering, organization, and connectivity to bring order to the world. As the modern world increasingly turned to infrastructure as a means of connecting people across vast distances, the Roman example loomed large. Today's highways, railroads, and even digital infrastructure continue to echo this Roman belief in the power of connectivity to shape society. The enduring nature of Roman roads also raises important questions about the role of infrastructure in shaping not just cities and economies, but societies themselves. How much does the built environment influence the way we interact with the world around us? Roman roads connected an empire that spanned diverse peoples, languages, and cultures, and they played a key role in the spread of Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman identity. In the modern world, our own systems of roads and highways still serve as the physical infrastructure that connects disparate parts of society, creating a shared sense of space and experience, even in an age of digital communication. In addition, the preservation of Roman roads also carries with it a sense of continuity between the past and the present. The very roads that the Romans built centuries ago have shaped the way we think about movement, communication, and connection. They remind us that the basic human desire to reach one place from another has not changed, even as the tools and technologies we use to fulfill that desire have evolved. As we reflect on the legacy of the Roman roads, we must ask ourselves, what can we learn from the Romans' dedication to creating infrastructure that connects people and places? How might their approach to roads and the values embedded in their creation inform how we design our cities, our highways, and our global systems of communication today? Are we continuing to build infrastructure that reflects the ideals of unity, accessibility, and connection? Or have we lost sight of those foundational values in the rush for speed and efficiency? In the end, the Roman roads are more than just pathways through the landscape. They are symbols of the timeless human desire to connect, to bridge the gaps between people and places, and to create lasting connections that transcend time. The Roman legions were the backbone of the Roman Empire, the military force that allowed Rome to expand from a small city-state into a vast empire spanning the 3 continents. For centuries, the legions marched, fought, and conquered, bringing Roman law, culture, and power to the furthest reaches of the empire. But behind the legendary battles and military strategies, the everyday life of a Roman legionary was one of discipline, routine, and constant training. These men, who would come to be known as the finest soldiers the world had ever seen, were forged not just in the crucible of battle, but in the rigorous life of military service. A Roman legionary's life began long before he ever set foot on the battlefield. The process of becoming a soldier was one that demanded physical strength, mental toughness, and the willingness to endure hardship for the sake of Rome. While many soldiers came from the rural classes, the desire for glory, status, and the prospect of a land grant after their service drove men from all walks of life to join the legions. To become a legionary, a young man had to meet strict criteria. He had to be a Roman citizen, physically fit, and free of major defects. His height, health, and stamina were all considered in the recruitment process. As the life of a soldier demanded physical resilience, once enlisted, a legionary entered a world governed by strict discipline and routine. The Roman army was a highly organized and efficient machine, and every legionary was trained to fit into that machine perfectly. Training began immediately and was relentless. New recruits, or miles, would undergo intense physical conditioning, including marching long distances in full armor, practicing formation drills, and learning how to fight with their weapons. Roman soldiers were trained to march up to 20 miles a day with a heavy pack, a feat that required incredible endurance and strength. The weapons and equipment of a Roman legionary were central to his identity as a soldier. The primary weapon of a legionary was the gladius, a short, double-edged sword that was perfect for close combat. The legionary also carried a large, rectangular shield called a scutum, which provided protection during battle and could be used to form tight, impenetrable lines with fellow soldiers. His armor, known as lorica segmentata, consisted of metal strips that covered his torso, providing protection while allowing for flexibility and mobility. The combination of these weapons and armor made the Roman soldier a formidable opponent in battle. But the life of a legionary was not just about combat. It was also about constant training, discipline, and the ability to function as part of a large, cohesive unit. The Romans were known for their ability to create highly disciplined military formations, and this was achieved through rigorous training and strict leadership. A legionary was expected to perform his duties with precision, whether that meant building a fort, constructing siege weapons, or maintaining the camp's cleanliness. Everything in the Roman army was designed to ensure efficiency and readiness. Roman legions were not just soldiers, they were builders, engineers, and administrators. One of the most important duties of a legionary was the construction of military camps, known as castra. These camps were often built overnight and were designed to be highly functional, providing the legion with all the resources it needed for a long campaign. The camp would be laid out with precision, with streets, defensive walls, and gates, creating a safe and organized environment for the soldiers. The construction of these camps was so efficient that it became one of the defining characteristics of the Roman military. In addition to the physical demands of army life, a legionary also had to learn how to live in harmony with his fellow soldiers. Roman legions were composed of thousands of men, and each soldier was part of a larger unit that included his fellow legionaries, centurions, and officers. The success of the legions was not just a result of individual skill, it was a result of teamwork and coordination. The strict hierarchy of the Roman military was designed to ensure that orders were followed without question. At the top of the chain were the legates, the commanding officers, followed by the centurions, who were in charge of smaller units known as centuries. The centurions, who were often veterans of the military, were the backbone of the Roman army, responsible for enforcing discipline and leading soldiers into battle. While the life of a legionary could be grueling, it also offered a number of rewards. The Roman army provided regular pay, food, and clothing, which was a significant benefit for many men who joined. Additionally, a legionary could receive a land grant after completing his service, providing him with the opportunity to settle in one of Rome's newly conquered territories. These rewards, along with the promise of glory in battle, made military service an attractive option for many young men in the Roman world. But life in the legions was not without its hardships. Soldiers often faced long periods of travel, sometimes enduring harsh weather conditions or fighting in unfamiliar and hostile territories. Illnesses, such as malaria, could take a heavy toll on soldiers who found themselves far from home. The discipline of the legions, though necessary for maintaining order, also meant that punishments for disobedience or cowardice were harsh. Desertion, for example, was often punishable by death. Despite these hardships, the Roman legions remained the most formidable military force in the ancient world. Their ability to adapt to new challenges, maintain strict discipline, and work together as a cohesive unit made them nearly unbeatable on the battlefield. But what made the Roman legions truly exceptional was their ability to organize and sustain military campaigns across vast distances. The roads they built, the fortresses they established, and the military tactics they employed allowed the legions to maintain control over the Roman Empire for centuries. But there were times when even the might of the Roman legions was not enough. Rome faced formidable enemies, including the Carthaginians during the Punic Wars, the Parthians in the east, and various barbarian tribes in Europe. While the Roman legions were unrivaled in many respects, they were not invincible. the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where three Roman legions were annihilated by an alliance of Germanic tribes, was one such disaster. The loss at Teutoburg demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most disciplined and experienced Roman soldiers when faced with new tactics and unfamiliar terrain. This defeat marked a turning point in Roman expansion into Germania, and it took years for the empire to recover. As we look at the history of the Roman legions, we must ask ourselves what made them so successful. Was it their training, their weapons, or their organization? Or was it something deeper, an ideology of discipline, duty, and loyalty to the empire that transformed them into one of the most powerful military forces the world has ever known? And as we reflect on their strength, we must also ask, what can we learn from the legion's approach to teamwork, leadership, and resilience in the face of adversity? The life of a Roman legionary was primarily defined by one singular purpose: battle. Whether defending the borders of the empire or expanding its reach through conquest, the Roman legions were the driving force behind the empire's military dominance. A Roman soldier's life was not simply about drilling or maintaining the camp. It was about being prepared to fight at any given moment, often under the most demanding conditions. To understand the Roman legion's success, we must delve into the strategic brilliance and military discipline that made them an unstoppable force across centuries of warfare. The Roman approach to battle was one of meticulous organization and innovation. Unlike the loose, chaotic formations of many ancient armies, the Romans employed highly structured tactics and formations that made them far more effective on the battlefield. The foundation of their combat strategy lay in the famous manipular formation, a system that allowed Roman soldiers to fight in smaller, flexible units rather than large, inflexible blocks. This formation was broken into units called maniples, which were divided into three lines: the hastati young, untested soldiers, the principes veterans, and the triarii seasoned warriors. These lines provided the army with both depth and adaptability. When battle began, the hastati would engage first, rushing toward the enemy with their short swords, the gladius, and their shields, known as the scutum. The hastati were supported by the principes, who would follow close behind, ready to take over if the younger soldiers faltered. The triarii, the most experienced, would form the final line, holding their position until it became absolutely necessary to fight. This arrangement allowed the Roman legions to maintain pressure and flexibility throughout the battle, with soldiers of varying levels of experience positioned strategically to support one another. The Roman military had perfected the concept of cohorts, which were essentially subunits of a legion, and each cohort could operate with a surprising degree of independence. The ability of Roman soldiers to form tight, coordinated lines allowed them to employ tactics like the testudo, or tortoise formation, in which soldiers would lock their shields together to form an impenetrable wall of protection. This formation was particularly effective in defending against missile attacks, such as those from enemy archers or slingers. The testudo demonstrated the Roman legion's ability to think strategically and adapt their tactics depending on the nature of the battle they were facing. A major advantage of the Roman legions was their emphasis on discipline. Roman soldiers were drilled relentlessly in the art of war, practicing formations and combat maneuvers repeatedly until they became second nature. This was not just about physical fitness, it was about mental toughness and obedience. A Roman soldier was expected to follow orders without question, and the strict hierarchy of the army ensured that orders were carried out precisely. Commanders, known as centurions, were responsible for enforcing discipline, and their authority was absolute. Even small infractions could result in severe punishment, including flogging or execution in extreme cases. The military's rigid discipline ensured that each soldier knew their role and would perform it with unwavering focus when the time for battle came. One of the most remarkable aspects of Roman battle tactics was the legion's ability to adapt to different environments and enemies. Roman soldiers were versatile, able to fight in diverse terrains, from the dense forests of Germania to the open plains of North Africa. Their roads, built specifically for the rapid movement of troops, allowed legions to quickly respond to threats and to move across vast distances with ease. While many ancient armies relied on traditional tactics that were effective only in certain conditions, the Romans were able to adjust their strategy and formations to suit the battlefield at hand. The Roman legions also excelled at siege warfare, a vital aspect of their military conquests. Roman engineers were some of the most innovative minds of their time, and they developed sophisticated tools to breach enemy fortifications. The famous Roman siege weapons included the ballista, a large crossbow capable of launching heavy projectiles, and the onager, a type of catapult. These weapons were used to destroy walls, gates, and then other defensive structures, enabling Roman soldiers to gain entry into heavily fortified cities. Roman engineers also created complex siege towers, battering rams, and even ladders that could be deployed quickly to scale walls or break through gates. The ability to wage successful sieges allowed the Romans to conquer cities and fortresses that would have been difficult or impossible to capture using conventional methods. Despite the Roman legion's brilliance in both strategy and tactics, there were times when even the most disciplined and well-equipped soldiers could falter. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, during the Second Punic War, remains one of the greatest defeats in Roman history. In this battle, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, using brilliant tactics and an understanding of the terrain, encircled and annihilated an entire Roman army. Despite the Roman legion's impressive military discipline and structure, they were outmaneuvered by Hannibal's strategic genius, and the battle became a devastating blow to the Roman war effort. However, the Romans, resilient as ever, would not let this defeat define them. Rather than retreating in defeat, they studied the battle closely, learning from their mistakes and refining their tactics. This resolve to never surrender or accept defeat is a hallmark of the Roman legions, which would rise from the ashes of defeat to become stronger and more formidable. The resilience of the Roman legions was tested time and again throughout their history. The Roman soldiers' ability to persevere in the face of hardship and their unwavering loyalty to their comrades and commanders was one of the key reasons for the empire's longevity. Whether they were fighting on the frontiers of the empire or defending the heart of Rome itself, the Roman legions showed a remarkable ability to recover from setbacks and continue to fight with determination and skill. In the final years of the Western Roman Empire, as barbarian invasions and internal instability began to weaken the empire, the Roman legions still played a critical role in defending the empire's borders. However, by the 5th century AD, the legions had been significantly weakened, both in terms of numbers and effectiveness. The rise of mercenary forces and the loss of key provinces marked the beginning of the end for the Roman military, as it had once been known. As the empire collapsed, so too did the Roman legions, but their legacy lived on. The structure and tactics of the Roman legions would influence the armies of future empires, and the idea of disciplined, organized military forces would shape the course of history for centuries to come. So, what was it that made the Roman legions so exceptional? Was it the soldiers themselves, their discipline, loyalty, and courage? Was it their advanced tactics and engineering feats, or was it the Roman system, which turned every soldier into a cog in a larger, unstoppable military machine? The truth is, it was a combination of all these factors that made the legions so formidable. They were not just soldiers, they were Roman citizens, bound together by a shared sense of duty, pride, and loyalty to an empire that valued strength, order, and unity above all. As we reflect on the Roman legions, we must ask, how do we, as individuals and as societies, define strength and resilience? How did the legions' commitment to discipline, their adaptability, and their unyielding loyalty enable them to achieve greatness? And what lessons can we take from their story as we face our own challenges in a constantly changing world? As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, its military forces, once the heart of imperial power, faded into history. The once feared legions, who had brought much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East under Roman control, were no longer the unstoppable force they once were. The loss of the legions marked the end of an era in military history, but their legacy endured far beyond the collapse of the empire. The Roman legions not only shaped the ancient world, but influenced military strategy, tactics, and then organizational structures for centuries to come. While the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for nearly another 1,000 years. Although the Byzantine army was not the same as the Roman legions of old, it still retained much of the Roman military tradition. The legion's organization, hierarchical structure, and military strategies would serve as the foundation for Byzantine warfare. The Byzantine army continued to employ Roman military formations, such as the use of infantry units supported by cavalry, and retained the legacies of Roman siege tactics, including the use of advanced fortifications and war machines. In addition to the Byzantine influence, the Roman legions left an indelible mark on the armies of medieval Europe. The military strategies that had been developed over centuries of Roman warfare were absorbed and adapted by various kingdoms. The idea of a standing professional army, as opposed to the feudal levies that characterized much of early medieval military practice, was one that emerged from Roman precedent. Furthermore, the Roman emphasis on discipline and training influenced the development of knightly orders and the establishment of military schools throughout medieval Europe. The legacy of the Roman legions can also be seen in the rise of mercenary forces and standing armies in the Renaissance. As European nations expanded their territories and sought to assert their power in the wake of feudalism, they looked back to the Romans for inspiration. Military leaders like Francesco Sforza of Milan and the Condottieri Italy's mercenary captains drew on Roman concepts of warfare to build their own armies. The Roman practice of recruiting soldiers from a wide range of backgrounds, including non citizens, was also mirrored in the Renaissance, where mercenaries from all over Europe were employed in the service of Italy's city states and kingdoms. However, it was not just military tactics and organization that the Roman legions passed down to future generations. The legions were also pioneers in the art of logistics and supply chains, which became essential to modern military campaigns. The Roman practice of maintaining well supplied camps, efficient road networks, and a structured approach to provisioning their armies became the standard for armies across the world. The legions understood that warfare was not just about brute force on the battlefield, it was about ensuring that your soldiers were well fed, well equipped, and able to move swiftly across vast distances. This logistical understanding continues to inform modern military strategy. The Roman road system, a tool of military conquest, would also leave a lasting legacy in the form of infrastructure. The same roads that allowed the legions to march quickly from one end of the empire to the other were eventually used for trade and travel, shaping the development of medieval and modern Europe. These roads facilitated not just military movements, but also the spread of ideas, cultures, and technologies. The interconnectedness fostered by Roman roads helped lay the foundation for the growth of towns, cities, and trade networks in the centuries following the empire's collapse. The legacy of the Roman legions is also felt in the modern concept of citizenship and military service. In the early Roman Republic, military service was tied to citizenship. Roman soldiers were not just mercenaries, they were citizens who fought to protect their homes and families. This connection between citizenship and military service would influence the development of national armies in the modern world, where soldiers are often seen as protectors of the state and its values. The idea of a citizen soldier who serves in times of need and returns to civilian life when peace is restored remains a cornerstone of modern military structures. In the realm of military theory, the influence of Roman legions has been profound. Roman writers and strategists, such as Vegetius, whose work De Re Militari became one of the most influential military treatises of the medieval and Renaissance periods, shaped the way military leaders approached warfare. Vegetius's emphasis on discipline, training, and logistics became fundamental principles for military organizations throughout history. His work was studied by Renaissance military leaders and, later, by European armies in the early modern period. The legion's approach to combat, with its emphasis on flexibility, coordination, and controlled aggression, remains a model for modern military strategy. Even in the 21st century, the influence of Roman legions can be seen in the organization and tactics of modern armies. While technology has drastically changed the tools of war, the fundamental principles of Roman military doctrine, such as the importance of discipline, coordination, and adaptability, still underpin the training of soldiers around the world. Modern military units, from special forces to conventional infantry, continue to emphasize teamwork, individual responsibility, and the ability to operate within complex, high-pressure environments, principles that were first honed by the Roman legions. The physical remnants of the Roman legion's presence continue to shape the world in ways that are often invisible to the modern observer. The Roman roads, fortifications, and military camps that still dot Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East stand as silent witnesses to the empire's once mighty military. The ruins of Roman forts and roads, such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain, and the remnants of Roman camps along the Danube, provide us with a glimpse into the daily lives of the soldiers who once manned them. These sites are not only important archaeological landmarks, they are living testaments to the enduring power of the Roman legions. As we reflect on the legacy of the Roman legions, we are reminded that their story is not just one of conquest and battle, but one of enduring influence and lasting impact. The legions were more than just soldiers. They were the embodiment of Roman civilization, the force that spread Roman culture, law, and the organization across the ancient world. The military prowess of the Roman legions ensured that the empire would last for centuries, and their legacy has continued to shape the world long after the empire itself faded into history. So, as we look at modern military organizations and reflect on the enduring lessons of the Roman legions, one question remains: how much of our own ideas about discipline, strategy, and military service have been shaped by the legacy of these ancient soldiers? And in a world increasingly defined by technology and digital warfare, can the timeless values of the Roman legion's loyalty, training, and unity still teach us something about the human spirit and the nature of military conflict?